First, thanks very much for the invitation to come speak here. I'm very impressed by, there we go, by what you're accomplishing here at SESYNC, although you're just started getting people from very different fields who basically speak different languages and work in different paradigms to work together, really conceive of new approaches, and be productive is very difficult and absolutely necessary for the major environmental issues that we're working on. So I've slightly modified the title here to include this concept of ecosystem services so that when we couple water, carbon, and nutrient cycling, those coupled ecosystem processes are really the coupled or bundled ecosystem services, or the providers, the functional providers of those ecosystem services. And I'm adding in the Coweeta LTER to Baltimore because what we learn in unmanaged watersheds should give us some lessons or guidelines for what we do in managed watersheds and vice versa. So the overview, there's this emerging emphasis on watershed management around priority ecosystem services, especially with their restoration. Freshwater quantity and quality, carbon sequestration, nitrogen retention. When you look at the major ecosystem services packages that are out there, they treat each one of those processes separately. There's a different model drawn off the shelf that simulates those. The only thing that connects them typically is the same GIS. But we want to treat these bundled ecosystem services as if they're fully coupled ecosystem processes. And that underlies a good deal of the emphasis of the research that I'll be showing you. Make a change in one, you should see that cascade into the others. So the question comes, what are the key landscape properties, dynamic structure that controls this coupling of these different elements? And we'll talk about flow path patterns of canopy and soil conditions, and also how those are conditioned by both the geomorphic and the built drainage network itself. And then what I'll put forward is the development of spatially distributed ecohydrological models that explicitly couple these different processes and cycles at landscape scales that we could observe and measure and that have this specific type of feedback. In addition, when we look at specific ecosystems, we should be learning things about how those ecosystem functions that could be applied to what we refer to as design or restoration principles. So let's see, you are, and you'll just tell me getting closer. You are somewhere around over here, here in Annapolis. The Baltimore Ecosystem Study is sitting up over here, largely in the Gwynns Falls watershed that goes from western Baltimore City through the county, and then in a county park and suburban development called Baseman's Run, which is up in Baltimore County. So there's a good gradient from a forested, coherent watershed, this is called Pond Branch, we'll refer down to that, through low density development, and then down the spine, 795 runs up here, there's a marked line, so it's one of the targeted development corridors coming out of metropolitan Baltimore, down through Western City where we have a set of our, whoops, going the wrong way, a set of our instruments down manhole covers in fully buried streams. This Baseman's Run area here is blown up over here. Pond Branch is our controlled forest watershed. This little mark that comes over here is a large natural gas pipeline that comes up from the Gulf Coast. All right, it's not pristine environment, but it's about as good as it gets when you're in the Baltimore area. And then we'll also refer to this upper portion of the watershed, which is developed at low density. I'll get this straight, and is on septic and well water. Coweeta looks quite different, steep Appalachian, fully forested catchments. There has been a disturbance history by experimentation, but we have a series of control catchments that are old growth hardwood forests that we could use as reference conditions. And these areas are very well studied. In this case, this is from another talk about coevolution of the catchment hydrology in the ecosystems with the geomorphology. So this is without a good deal of human intervention, and we want to see what properties emerge in these types of watersheds, what can we learn in them about ecosystem behavior that could be applied towards managed systems. So characteristics of watersheds regulating water, carbon, and nitrogen, cycling and export. Just a list here, there's the water portion here, the major water cycling, storage, and flux. The carbon cycling as well from stomatal physiology controlling photosynthesis through the development of carbohydrates that get allocated around a canopy, growth of the canopy into foliar stem and root biomass, and then the cycling back into the soil as well. In this case, just nitrogen we're dealing with right now. The nitrogen cycling, and of course, these are all coupled across here. The stomatal physiology is a strong joint control on photosynthesis and evapotranspiration. And of course, the production of the leaf area is a major control on the hydrology as well. So there are mutual feedbacks that take place within here. I haven't put in any human disturbance or management, but along these processes which take place at a patch scale or at a plot scale, any water or solutes will then be transported within hydrologic flow paths so that there is an upslope to downslope communication. And you could think of that as an upslope to downslope subsidy of water and nutrients as well. So the connectivity, the degree of connection between the ecosystem patches, between ridge and stream, is a major tenet and subject to the type of work that we're doing. This shows in a little bit more detail some of the ecosystem model. In other words, gross photosynthesis, respiration, allocation and growth respiration, and then the cycling back and forth here. So this is really the carbon budget. For nitrogen, this is a gross simplification. This is Brady textbook nitrogen cycling. We're not dealing with anammox or dissimilatory reduction of ammonium and so forth. And a 0-to-1 multiplier on maximum rates. Oops, I'm going to get this straight eventually. There we go. This soil moisture saturation, it's really a surrogate for oxygen content. But as we go from more aerobic to more anoxic conditions, we have this crossover from more strongly nitrifying to more strongly denitrifying. And if we have in situ coupled nitrification and denitrification, we're looking at some sort of a process that may peak in some of these areas in terms of nitrogen turnover. But once again, the important thing is soil moisture can be one method of scaling this process around the landscape, given carbon, temperature, pH limitations, and other drivers, microbial processes. Each plot, each patch is a full ecosystem model within our framework. There's a Penman-Monteith ET with a full stomatal physiology. We distribute water with either top model or what's called the distributed hydrology soil vegetation model. This comes out of the University of Washington, which we've generalized, and this allows the horizontal flux and divergence of water. Otherwise, I'll just have you read these rather than go into these in detail. The model is described in this wiki that Christina Tague is now maintaining at UCSB. So originally, I was a hill slope geomorphologist. My first journal article was on crop photosynthesis, although I was doing my dissertation in hill slope geomorphology. And from that, we started to develop models with a series of colleagues, which is a unit ecosystem model for each patch on a hill slope. Each patch can receive, if you like, kind of a shot pattern of rainfall at different arrival frequencies. It can retain a certain amount, well, this will work. A certain amount can start leaking and moving down slope, and then the next patch down receives precipitation but is also subsidized by a filtered version of that shot pattern coming in. In other words, a much lower frequency varying signal of both water and nitrogen coming in. So we should see some evolution, or we could see some evolution of the ecosystem down these hydrologic flow paths from more xeric systems up here, depending on the climate once again, to better watered and nutrient enriched ecosystems down here. This riparian area should emerge through the model, through the dynamics of the model. If it's wetter, there should be lower rates of decomposition, there should be higher accumulation of organic matter, and we should see a signature of the biogeochemistry up and down here The nice thing is, besides sticking in probes into the soil to look at fast response of soil moisture or temperature, we have long-term accumulation of leaf area and soil biogeochemistry, which we could measure as well. So these are additional measurements that need to be consistent to show the joint evolution of these types of models. Most hydrology models look to see how much water goes down the drain. There are a variety of different ways to fit a hydrograph. This constrains the model so that you need to get the amount going down the drain, its quality, distribution of soil moisture, and then these longer-term memory effects that accumulate within the system. Each hill slope drains into a stream, and that dendritic pattern of streams, if you'd like, you could think of this dendritic pattern as a tree network. The hill slopes as the leaves on the tree, and then, just to be redundant, the patches having trees on the leaves of the tree, and so forth. So each one of these patches is an independent ecosystem model, but is linked in this flow path at the hill slope scale. They all contribute water and solutes to the stream network itself. So what happens when we move into the neighborhood and muck it up? Well, we add lots of stuff. We irrigate. We could double the amount of water being provided to each ecosystem patch. We certainly advertently add things such as fertilizer or other soil conditioners, and we occasionally go oops and spill things as well. Wastewater treatment and disposal. We've often in hydrology or ecosystems treated those as, well, that's something else, but it's intrinsically part of this ecosystem. So when we say ecosystem, human, and so forth, those are all artificial barriers. Wastewater treatment centers, either on-site or convey and treat, is part of the ecosystem cycling itself and should be treated as such. We alter hydrologic flow paths. We certainly put in lots of impervious surfaces. We put in street drainage. We put in storm and sanitary sewers. Baltimore, by the way, is largely a separate sewer system. It was separated as far back as the 20s. And then, of course, we do different things to vegetation. We maintain it. It does not necessarily evolve spontaneously, but it has a strong human component in terms of both selection of species and its spacing. Won't spend much time of this. The RESIS, the model that Margaret briefly mentioned, Regional Hydro-Ecological Simulation System. Regional, initially we were applying it to large watersheds as large as the South Platte, 63,000 square kilometers. We're coming down in scale, as you'll see, so that we're looking at intensively monitored smaller catchments now. And then the goal right now that we're partially talking about in the WSSI, as amongst a number of other things, is how do you scale these back up towards larger regions. It's a containment hierarchy. There's somewhere out here something called the world. There are basins within which stream routing occurs. There are hill slopes that I showed you before. There's lateral soil moisture flux at that scale. Zones, climate processing, well, if we have lots of elevational variation, then those may vary by elevation bands. There may be synoptic scale zones, climate zones, and this could actually move up so that you have one zone for the entire basin, or it could be down to the level of every patch has a unique microclimate. So that's a little bit more variable. Patches are what exists along the hill slope. Canopy strata within each patch, you could have multiple species, multiple stories in terms of an overstory, a shrub layer. We've put in non-vascular systems for boreal systems, lichens and mosses and so forth. And you could also now have impervious areas, rooftops and so forth. And at each scale, certain processes are written for each scale and each object. So you could think of it as sort of object-oriented. There is a certain set of properties for each scale, and there's a certain set of processes for each scale as well. And they interact up and down this hierarchy by the movement of material. Okay. The model looks something like this. There is a good deal, although this is a small box, this is 80% of your time. And so one of the things we're talking about doing now is how do you speed this up? How do you automate these workflows so that you could get all this information over the web where it's available? In many cases, it may be project specific as well, but that data management is a good deal of work and effort to do and do properly and to document. once again, this comes up in this hierarchy: watersheds and zones and hill slopes and patches and strata as well. And each process exists within one of these. There's a climate time series. We had actually coupled this to RAMS several years ago. RAMS, the Regional Atmospheric Modeling System. We put in RESAs as a boundary layer model. You could prescribe a disturbance history. One of the things we're working on right now is how can we use the state of the ecosystem, litter amount, litter moisture content as an example, as a method of conditioning fire models. So we have some projects with the Forest Service on this. And so we move into the neighborhood. Once again, we have to also state what do we do in terms of fertilization levels, irrigation, property management in general. So that's the challenge, from a full ecosystem model to something where we move in and muck up or make the territory perhaps a little bit more interesting. So let's look to see how this works within a watershed. This is now back in Coweeta. The color coding is such that if it's colored, there's at least 60% saturation, soil saturation level. It's not that there's no soil moisture in these brown areas, it's just below 60% saturation. And we'll run through a year's worth of precipitation, look at the output, and then the idea, once again, is these ridgetop patches are processing water and nutrients and then yielding them down through this flow network to lower patches on the hill slope, so we have more subsidized systems. So we'll range from more xeric towards more mesic systems in this region. Let's see if I can get this one going. Okay, so this is 2004. The other thing we were doing this for is we're interested in these dark blue areas, fully saturated. Those have high pore pressures. And up in this region, we had a series of landslides that occur. So we're both fixing carbon, we're cycling nutrients, we're also looking for conditions where we'll have slope instability. And we're using this to map slope hazard in small watersheds, looking for the probability of landslides in these different areas. So we'll run through a full year here, and this is the classic variable source area popping on as you get a rain event. Here's a hurricane. This is Hurricane, I think, Ivan coming on. The whole area wets up, and then it's wet to begin with. By the time Francis comes in, the whole area wets up. That's when the landslides occur. A smaller set of thunderstorms, but it's already pretty darn wet, so it flashes up as well. Good deal of flooding, and there were much larger landslides in that area. So that's how this would look from a hydrological perspective. We work in Coweeta because we have a good deal of instrumentation. These are TDR, time domain reflectometry, soil moisture measurements in 3 different sites in Watershed 18 that we're showing over here, an undisturbed hardwood forest. And this is let's see if I could recall this because this doesn't even show up that well to me, a xeric, a mesic, a semi-mesic, and a xeric site. And although it doesn't show quite that well, we're showing the discharge, observed and simulated discharge. We need a bigger screen for this. And we could tune the model to get the discharge hydrograph fairly well with a variety of different structures. You don't need a detailed distributed model for this. But what we're looking for is, can we also fit the soil moisture traces at these other areas at the same time? And then once again, if we go out to see the longer term manifestations of that in terms of soil, biogeochemistry, and in the case I'll show you here, leaf area, we have more confidence that this system is integrating amongst these processes properly. So this is the leaf area measured because this is using remote sensing. It's using iconosymmetry, which is 4 meter multispectral, and a series of different measurements on the ground around this area so we could calibrate a remote sensing signal. This is what the leaf area actually looks like. This is what we simulate. And what I like to do now is go like this and blink a little bit because we're not going to get the high frequency variation in leaf area because there are bugs and there's wind throw and there's landslides, and we're not simulating all of that here. So what we're looking for, are we getting this approximate sort of ridge to lower slope variation in leaf area? And one is very noisy, one is very filtered, and so we have to take that into account. But if we're confident that we can get these approximate distributions of leaf area, then we could ask questions in terms of why does this type of arrangement actually tend to occur. At the surface, it's fairly easy. It's drier up here, lower LAI. Although it rains 1 to 2 meters here a year, ecologists have long recognized that there's a water stress gradient up the hill slopes and recognize from the flora different associations according to that gradient. But it's not just that it's wetter down here. You have this subsidy. So there is this linkage of ecosystem patches as you move down these flow lines. So there's a question of why do is that a particular property of how that LAI is actually adjusting? The question we asked is answered here, and this is a question we posed. Do you get a pattern of leaf area with a higher order property? Are you getting a pattern of leaf area that, given the soil conditions and the climate, gives you a maximum in evapotranspiration and net primary productivity? This is an extension of an old theory in ecohydrology that's called the Eagleson hypothesis, which was done at the plot level, that looks at an adjustment and an evolution of vegetation, soil, and climate conditions. But because you have this downslope subsidy, you have this variable amount of input to each patch, and therefore you have an adjustment of the entire pattern. So the question we're asking is, does the actual pattern of leaf area, adjusted and co-evolved over a period of time, reflect a pattern that actually maximizes ET and NPP at the full catchment scale, not just at the individual patch? So what we have here is we have the color coding here is leaf area index, is the mean absolute error of the leaf area index between our simulated and observed. This is the net primary productivity and the evapotranspiration here. And we have to look for different strategies of rooting as well. This is the mean rooting depth. This is a deviance of the rooting depth. I won't go into it in that much detail, but it's a scalar. So if we were at 0, no variation in rooting depth up and down the hill slope. If it's negative, rooting depth decreases downslope. If it's positive, rooting depth increases downslope. And what's emerging here, by the way, manual measurements of rooting depth from a dissertation done in 1976 when people took out shovels and they were really serious about it. You didn't spend a lot of time behind a computer screen at that point. You spent a lot of time with a shovel. Came up with 0.8 meters as the mean rooting depth in this area. By the way, the parameterization for this also maximizes the explanation of the discharge and the soil moisture, as I showed you before. At that 0.8 or approximately 0.8 meters and not much variation, we're getting the peak NPP and the best explanation, the minimum mean absolute error for the leaf area. Maximizes NPP and ET. Okay, so this is a larger scale suggestion. Do these natural ecosystems evolve to maximize retention? Simply because of the connection and the filtering of nutrients and water downslope. You don't get the highest LAI up here, obviously it's water limited, but then you're getting this progressively larger LAI as you move down through these areas because those will actually maximize the uptake. That'll maximize the uptake of the total soil, moisture and nutrient that's being transported. Okay, let's move into the city and see what can we make of this. Are there design principles we could make use of? Basements Run. Pond Branch is the forest primeval in the Baltimore ecosystem study. Most of the watershed area, Basements Run, is Pond Branch-like. It's just this upper 1/3 of the watershed that's been developed in low-intensity suburban. By the way, this is the site that Reds Wallman was taking his classes out for 40 years. So a nice thing about this is we have discharge over a long period of time. We have maps of conversion of agricultural fields to suburban sites since the 1960s. We have some old hydrographs. Reds had a flume up here from the 1960s, some setographs from when it was an agricultural area. So it's a very nice area to look at the development of these former farm fields up here into either forest or suburbs over a 50 to 60 year time scale. Dead Run is where this little circular site over here is around the Social Security Administration. There's some big box stores through here as well, so very highly impervious, built out in the 1950s. So a good juxtaposition here. Septic, well water, central service for both sanitary and water supply. A series of different weirs that are in this area that Claire Welty has been putting up with Andy Miller as part of the Baltimore ecosystem study. So two good sites to actually contrast. This is, going back here, this is this site down over here. It straddles 695. We call this DR5, Dead Run 5. It's about a square kilometer tributary. So we'll look at some of these sites as well. If we look at the range of sites in the Baltimore ecosystem study, this is the nitrogen export, and by far McDonough is the agricultural site. So the first conclusion is that ag sites still, by far and away, yield the most nitrogen. Even compared to the central city, here is, let's see, Carroll Park, the gauge is underneath I-95. Glendon is an older suburban. Here's Dead Run right here. So by comparison, this farm field, this agricultural catchment yields way more than that central high impervious site. Just mapping impervious surface to impact does not always work. Here's Baseman's Run. In terms of here's Baseman's Run. By the way, what I've done here is because these are mixed land use catchments, I've used the pond branch yield. That should actually be about over here or so, fairly low, and use that as a model for all forested area in these catchments. Remember, Baseman's Run is 2/3 forest. Carroll Park, although the gauge is underneath I-95, has about 20% forest or so. So I'm proportionally removing the forest contributions and just looking at the developed area contributions. What that's telling us is that the Baseman's Runs of the world, the low density suburban sites on septic, aside from the agricultural areas, are by far the dominant contributors of nitrogen in this region. Way more than the central city components and these types of dead runs. And this is both for total nitrogen and nitrate. Perhaps this one should have come first. This shows the nitrogen export. So once again, pond branch is way down here. This is without the forest removal. So this is the raw gauge loads that are occurring. Once again, Baseman's Run then doesn't come out to be quite as high because it's 2/3 forest. So it's 2/3 pond branch type of area.
Did Dead Run have pretty good well-developed stormwater infrastructure?
Dead Run is completely separated stormwater and sanitary infrastructure. So I'll show you, if we have time, a little animation later. Sanitary systems are not completely separate from storm activities. That is a source of a major nutrient content during surcharging events. Okay, so here is Pond Branch, Baseman's Run again. This is a 1/2 meter resolution LiDAR, so we could look at this distribution of flow from ridge down to stream in fair detail. We'll be looking at Pond Branch over here, and this one we call Baseman's Run 5. There's older 1960s development over here, 1980s development over here, 1990s development over here, and 2000s development over here. So we have this nice gradation, decadal gradation of infrastructure and development going in. The bottom of Pond Branch is a riparian wetland. This is fairly common in the Piedmont, right up at the headwaters before the streams really integrate. So a fairly mucky, you could see all the skunk cabbage, and I'm not an ecologist, so I'll ask you for all the other species identification for this. But wet, mucky, it's typically completely saturated during the winter. It only starts to dry out in limited amounts during the summertime. Topographic wetness. Wetness is actually, or soil moisture is actually fairly predictable by something we refer to as the topographic wetness index. This is the area drained per unit contour length divided by the gradient. And making a series of measurements, I think in about 20 sites, One important thing is we go in and within an area, maybe half the size of this room, a 5-meter radius, we make 20 random measurements of soil moisture, and these are just the means. Other work that's been done in the past where people take a single TDR measurement, the noise level is too high, but we have a fairly predictable variation in wetness, once again, fairly dry days to wetter days that develops here. This is one of the signals we'd like to be able to capture with the models. The lowlands, the bottomlands here, vary from that. So you look at this trend here, that's sitting over here, this trend over here, the bottomlands, the riparian areas up here, it's receiving deeper groundwater. So it's maintained as a very wet system, and according to that diagram I showed you before, it should be more strongly denitrifying if there's nitrate available. Around the corner in Baseman's Run 3, it's structurally just the same as Pond Branch, but the streams are trenched a meter or more. A small amount of impervious area, about 5% or so, and that's enough to trench these streams fairly well. So you're actually leaving those lowest regions right down by the stream as somewhat drier. You remove the riparian function of those areas. The flow paths come in at depth. They're bypassing the organic-rich regions. And the soil moisture, then, you could see that as well, somewhat similar to Pond Branch. Now, this is actually in Glendon, which is a suburban catchment. It's not the Baseman's Run site, but as a similar structure. You get this general increase in the mean soil moisture content with the topographic wetness index, but it turns down as you approach the stream. So these riparian areas are actually now drier than some of these mid-slope positions. And we, in fact, see upland vegetation regenerating in this area underneath riparian generation. Riparian vegetation is no longer regenerating in this area. So these are very busy, and I'll just give you the take-home message. This is a CQ diagram. It's nitrate concentration against runoff. I've normalized this by area. I've divided the volume by area so I get a depth in millimeters per day. And for those of you who think in terms of CFS, a millimeter a day is about equal to a cubic foot per second per day per square mile. Sorry, a cubic foot per second per square mile as a mean daily discharge. The important thing is in Pond Branch, the undeveloped site, the highest concentrations of nitrate are at the lowest runoff levels under the driest conditions. By the time we get down to a millimeter a day, which is a fairly moderate flow, the nitrate has just about disappeared for most of the time, or at least for the entire winter. And you could see that vaguely here. This is a fitted, a low-dest fit to the concentration data. We're sitting down at the detection limit. So the only time we see nitrate in the streams above the detection limit is summer periods. It disappears completely during the winter because of denitrification. Remember, the area is natural without an external input of nitrogen except for atmospheric deposition. Baseman's Run is on septic systems. By the way, notice the scales over here. We're peaking at about, maybe 0.2, up to about 0.2 milligrams of nitrogen per liter. This is actually the loads themselves in kilograms per hectare. We have an order of magnitude higher loads. So we're peaking at about 0.001, peak one at about 0.01 kilograms per hectare per day. We're getting up to about 0.1. So an order of magnitude higher, of course, in the suburban development, which has septic systems. The important difference here is rather than this sort of exponential decline, we have a log scale over here. This comes up and peaks at about a millimeter per day. So a very different CQ, concentration discharge graph. So that has ramifications for when nitrogen comes out, how much comes out as well. Simulations with rhesus, this is for Pond Branch. Once again, discharge hydrographs are easy to fit in general. There's lots of knobs. We try to reduce the knobs. We're only calibrating here for a conductivity and a change in conductivity with depth for this. It's run through the entire ecosystem model, generates the discharge, And this is some early simulations we did for this. The ability to capture this distinct seasonal dynamics of the nitrate is shown here, and I'll show a couple of different examples. This is with 10-meter patches. That riparian area is about 30 meters wide. So at 10 meters, I could resolve that there is this wet, mucky bottomland that has this fairly persistently wet area at the base, except during the driest summers. And simulated and observed, the red dots are observed, shows we're able to pick up these seasonal dynamics fairly well. At the daily time scale, we don't have observations. We have put in SUNA UV nitrate sensors, so we'll be able to better see how well we're doing on diurnal patterns, on dial patterns. At 30 meters, the whole bottomland disappears in the simulation. At 30 meters, you can't pick up that 30-meter wide bottomland because you're fitting a slope across 3 pixels, across 3 grid cells with a central difference expression. So you have a much more uniform slope that occurs, and you don't get this mucky bottom with these sharp breaks in slope. So 30 meters is not enough to find this strong ecosystem function that only shows the nitrate showing up during the summertime. And we could come up with mixed methods as well, with mixed cell sizes here. What's missing here is that small-scale heterogeneity that's being picked up here can pick up the nitrogen cycling. Remember that graph of nitrification, denitrification, decomposition that was strongly nonlinear in the soil moisture. If you suppress that, you're getting rid of the extremes, which drives the system. A paper that Christina Tague and I put out a couple of years ago shows the degree of bias. This would be, if everything was uniform, this adds in the heterogeneity as well. So this includes the soil moisture variance, theta variance here. So the strong bias, if you don't put in proper resolution or some representation of the heterogeneity around these riparian areas. So that's an important take-home message. We run the standard spatial data infrastructure, 30-meter DEMs, TM, leaf area, or NLCD data. We're losing a lot of these properties of these small first-order streams. I'll remind you, first-order streams is more than 50% of the cumulative stream length in any watershed by definition. It's simply a property of those types of tree graphs. Okay, move across the street and down the road, Baseman's Run, and this is what your typical area will look like. We've now changed the vegetation from the hardwood to a pasture or a lawn. We put in this ephemeral stream called a road and a curb right at mid-slope, so it's a drain. So these long drainage lines that came down like this are interrupted. There's a black hole over here called a storm sewer inlet. And there's Mr. Lawn King that we call up to spread more nitrogen as well. All of that has to be captured. We have to be able to estimate how much Mr. Lawn King is spraying over here or how much individual residents. We can't do this with great fidelity for every patch, but we have to have a good statistical distribution of it. And because there's such high uncertainty, the model has to be structured so it could be run 2,000 to 3,000 times to take into account the uncertainty of those. So once again, this is Baseman's Run 3, and then we'll do some simulation in this area. We have information as to where the septic spreading fields are from the original construction diagram. So we're mixing in very different types of data aside from what we refer to as the National Spatial Data Infrastructure. We have to be able to capture that and manage it. So there are these 3 tributaries that I said have different build-outs. This is the nitrogen concentration at Baseman's Run at Ivy Hill Road. That's the entire watershed, including 2/3 pond branch type ecosystem forests. And then these 3 watersheds above it as well. BR3, Baseman's Run 3, is this one here. And that has nitrate concentrations getting up to about 2.5 to 3. By the way, I'll point out that this newest subdivision, let's see, this is BR5A, this is the 2000s, has nitrate concentrations as high as a cornfield. It does have a very recent crop of lawn put onto it, and it's the recent subdivisions where the hot spots of lawn fertilization. We've done a series of lawn surveys, lawn household management surveys, and you see this spike as you get up towards the most recent subdivisions. They're establishing a lawn. It's on fairly crappy soils, old ag soils that are devoid of organic material, and the developer is putting about this much organic top dressing on, and then they're just putting on a lot of nutrients for this. This is the simulation of the discharge in this subdivision, subdivision watershed. So we're able to once again pick up within limits the discharge dynamics. And then with this cut, with this stream cut as well, this is a simulation that shows, this is the saturation deficit. So it's the reverse of the saturation level. It's the water equivalent below saturation. So high saturation deficit means drier conditions. And it's done under two conditions. Let's see now. This is adjacent to the stream, a pixel that's adjacent to the stream, and that's we did a numerical experiment here. This is without a trench, so with a pond branch type of bottomland, without an incision, and the purple is with an incision. So right adjacent to the stream, you can see the dynamics. With an incision, you're getting much drier conditions developing. You don't really develop quite as dry conditions. This is the pond branch condition, where it starts to dry out to a certain extent, never gets really dry, whereas we're able to get departures of twice the dryness or distance below the saturation level. 15 meters away, you see no evidence of the stream. So an extremely localized condition. The groundwater table is simply sloped down towards the stream bottom in this area. Out at the break of slope, we see no effect of this. Once again, high resolution heterogeneity somehow has to be represented to capture this ecosystem dynamic. And I'm just about done here. This is simulated dissolved in organic nitrogen. It's nitrate, nitrite and nitrate. At the base of Baseman's Run 3, these are older simulations that Neely Law did several years ago. And this is going into this major drought we had in 2002. And there's the good, the bad, and the ugly in this. Initially, as we went into the drought, we were simply off. Red is measured, the blue diamonds are modeled, and we simply were not capturing this difference right in this area. There's a variety of different reasons for that. As we went into the drought, we were able to capture this large drop that took place. By the way, this is sort of a wet up period during this time, and then a drop. We're not sure if this is a spin-up problem or problems showing the three-dimensional structure of these septic plumes. We're still working on this right now. But as we had that wet up, we seemed to capture that fairly well. Once again, an order of magnitude higher than pond branch. This is part of what we're working on right now with potentially with this WSSI project that we're here working on right now, is to get better information as to what was actually taking place here. One thing we didn't do, this was still a dry period, but it wasn't completely dry. This is really the height of the drought. We didn't also put in human behavior here. And so as we were going into the drought, people started to conserve water. There's less water coming out of the septic systems and spreading systems. We didn't include that. So one possibility is that as things were starting to dry out, that difference in the source water may have made that type of difference. Once again, human behavior starts to become dominant. Let me just try to finish up. This is then using the model to try to simulate green infrastructure for Baseman's Run, which is extensive lawn. What would happen if we either came in with half tracks and tanks and said, all lawns are gone, we're reforesting every single spot in here except the houses and the drives. Or if we negotiated and says, okay, you could keep your downslope lawn, but we're planting all the uplands and trees. Or no, we're going to put trees in all the lower slopes. You could keep your upslope lawns in terms of simulated response. I won't go through these in detail. I could play for you the same type of soil moisture animation that we showed for Coweeta. But what came out was something a little bit unexpected. We all know that riparian forests are the best design because it'll maximize uptake of moisture and retains stormwater. What came out, this is seasonally. This is the total amount of precipitation seasonally. This is the current land cover. This is when we convert all lawn to forest. This is when we convert just the downslope lawn to forest, so riparian forest. And then this is upland forest. We would have expected that the upslope forest, in other words, the downslope forest, downslope lawn to forest, should be the most retentive design. In fact, it yields a little bit more water than the upslope forest. And once again, this is because the upslope is subsidizing the downslope. Same thing we looked at in Coweeta. So you only generate runoff, especially overland flow, during wet periods. If you're capturing more of the water by evapotranspiration seasonally, in that upslope area, you have less of a subsidy to the downslope area. So what came out of this, which was somewhat counterintuitive, upland forest is just as good, if not somewhat better, than lowland forest in this type of Piedmont geomorphology for retaining moisture in this area. I should say the peaks are higher when we have upland forest as opposed to lowland forest. I think we're just about done. I haven't spoken about it, but there's a whole other portion where we're working with community sociologists, interviewing people on what do you do to your lawn. I want to know something completely utilitarian. How many kilograms of nitrogen per hectare per year do you put on your lawn? Just imagine somebody, instead of getting a call and saying, hello, this is the Obama administration. Hello, how many kilograms of nitrogen? And of course, it requires quite a bit of questioning. And do you use this? Do you do it yourself? Do you call it Mr. Lawn King? Do you use this bag from Lowe's? Do you use this bag from Home Depot? About how many times a year? And then getting household rates and averaging to subdivisions. That's about the signal we think we can get. But there's all sorts of interesting information. What do people think about their neighborhood? How much cohesion? Where do they learn their fertilization practices? Are there subdivision bylaws that partially governs how this takes place as well? So this is the whole other area that I think SESYNC is particularly dealing with. What does the community sociology and the social and the socioeconomic structure, how does that explicitly link to all this hydrology and biogeochemistry? So this is the end, I promise. Naturalistic landscapes seem to evolve to retain water and nutrients along flow paths. So this should inform us to an extent on if we're doing targeted planting, and every major Northeast city at this point has a campaign to put in. Mayor Bloomberg has the Million Tree campaign. It's not just for the area between 14th Street and 96th Street. It's for the boroughs where there's a lot more open land as well. Where should we put those trees? What should we expect to come out of them? Are there strategic tree planting patterns and exercises we can come up with? With development, this flow path engineering first tends to destroy the riparian zone functionality because of this trenching, aside from increasing loading of nutrients by an order of magnitude. So what type of engineering or green infrastructure can we put in to maximize retention? Development inverts the topographic soil moisture patterns. Instead of having the maximum soil moisture patterns in the riparian areas because of that trenching, you're getting some of the minimum soil moisture patterns there, and we're seeing upland forests regenerate there, and biogeochemically, they're behaving like upland forests. I think I'll leave it at that point. These are, of course, some of the things I stated we still need to do some more work on. There's other work dealing with sourcing. Where is the end coming from? Septic, fertilizer, atmospheric deposition done with isotopes, but I think we're about time to quit at this point. So I'll quit.
Thanks, Larry.